It's sometime in 1952, on a hill in the Philippine province of Pampanga, and a soldier is missing. He was the last man in his patrol, 8, maybe 10 guerrillas, walking single file down a jungle trail at night, the way you do when you've spent years learning that the government's army owns the daylight and you only own the dark. And then he wasn't there anymore. No gunshot, no struggle anyone heard. He was just gone.
His unit doubles back to look for him, and they find him lying in the middle of the trail, where anyone would see him. He's been dead a few hours. There are 2 puncture wounds in his neck, and he has been drained completely of blood. Nobody in that patrol needed it explained to them what had happened. Everyone in that part of the country had grown up on the same stories, told by the same grandparents, about the thing that lives in the hills and comes down at night to feed. They call it the Aswang, and for the rest of that night and the entirety of the next day, a few hundred armed communist insurgents, men who had fought the Japanese army, who had fought the Philippine government, who had fought for years without flinching, became by every account absolutely terrified. By the next morning, the camp was empty. The entire unit had walked off that hill.
Here's the part that should bother you more than the vampire story does. There was no Aswang. There was no monster. There was a man with a knife working for the government of the United States who had been told to make a myth real enough to win a war with. And this single grotesque little incident on a hillside nobody can even agree the name of is maybe the smallest, strangest thread in a much bigger story. A story about a CIA officer who didn't just help defeat an insurgency in the Philippines. He helped pick the next president. He wrote that president's slogans. He may have written his campaign song. He had a literal coup plan sitting in his back pocket in case the election didn't go his way. So let's pull on the thread. Let's talk about the time the CIA invented a vampire, and then invented a president to go with it.
To understand why any of this happened, you have to understand one man first. Not a general, not a spy in the Bond sense, no gadgets, no glamour, an advertising executive. Edward Lansdale spent the years before World War II in San Francisco, working in advertising, doing the unglamorous, deeply American work of convincing people to want things they didn't need. Soap, cars, the minor, ordinary alchemy of persuasion.
Then the war happened, and the U.S. military discovered something useful in men like Lansdale, that the skills you use to sell toothpaste are, with very minor adjustments, the skills you use to win a population's loyalty or break its will. He joined the Army. He ended up in the Office of Strategic Services, the wartime precursor to the CIA, the organization that basically invented American spycraft from scratch in real time, with no rulebook and an awful lot of improvisation. By 1950, with the war over and a new one, the Cold War, well underway, Lansdale found himself in the Philippines, officially as a U.S. Air Force officer, attached to something called JUSMAG, the Joint U.S. Military Assistance Group. Unofficially, he was already CIA. This dual identity, uniformed officer on paper, intelligence operative in practice, would become something close to his entire career. And the Philippines in 1950 was a country in serious trouble.
Here's something that gets flattened out of a lot of tellings of this story, and it shouldn't be, because it's the whole reason any of this was possible in the first place. The Hukbalahap, the Hooks for short, were not originally the bad guys of this story. The name itself, Hukbalahap, is short for Hukbon ng Bayan Laban sa Hapon, the People's Army against Japan. They were formed during World War II to fight the Japanese occupation of the Philippines. They fought well. They fought hard, and a lot of them assumed that when the war ended, the country they'd helped liberate would actually, listen to them. It didn't.
Post-war Philippine politics was a mess of corruption, landlord power, and a peasantry that had been promised land reform for decades and never gotten it.
The economic deal the U.S. set up with its newly independent former colony, the Bell Trade Act, heavily favored American business interests over Filipino ones. Veterans who'd fought the Japanese were getting denied benefits. People who'd risked their lives for the country were going back to landlords who still owned everything and shared nothing. So the Hucks didn't disband. They turned their guns on the new government instead. And over the next few years, with growing communist backing and growing rural support, they came uncomfortably close to actually threatening the state. This is the part where Washington gets nervous. It's 1950. China just fell to the communists the year before. Korea is on fire. And here's an archipelago of 7,000 islands, a former American colony, strategically sitting right in the middle of the Pacific, looking like it might be next. So in comes Lansdale. Officially, an advisor. Unofficially, a man with a blank check and a genuinely strange theory of how wars get won. Lansdale's basic idea, and this would define basically his entire career, all the way through Vietnam later, was that you don't have to kill an insurgency. You can scare it, demoralize it, and humiliate it into giving up. Bullets are expensive. Fear is free. He started small. He had reconnaissance planes fly low over Hook-controlled villages on overcast days, broadcasting eerie recorded curses in Tagalog through loudspeakers, vague, ominous warnings aimed at anyone caught helping the rebels. It sounds almost comically low-tech today. It reportedly worked anyway, starving a few Hook units of local support simply by terrifying the villagers who'd been feeding and sheltering them. Then there was something Lansdale, with what I can only assume was real pride, called the Eye of God. His men would identify suspected Hook sympathizers, sneak out at night, and paint a single, cryptic, all-seeing eye on a wall near that person's home. No note, no explanation, just the eye. Lansdale's own words on this, he wrote later that the eyes had, quote, a sharply sobering effect the next morning. Translation, you wake up, you see that someone knows exactly what you've been doing, and you have absolutely no idea who or how or what they're planning to do about it. That kind of fear is incredibly effective, and it costs nothing but a paintbrush. So, by the time Lansdale's team sat down to study local folklore in more depth, they already had a working theory. Psychological terror is cheap, and it's devastating if you understand what a specific population is actually afraid of. And that's how they found the Aswang. If you didn't grow up in the Philippines, the Aswang might sound at first like just another vampire, a regional variation on Dracula. It is not that. It's older, weirder, and considerably more flexible as a monster. The Aswang isn't one fixed creature. It's a category. Depending on the region, the story, the grandmother telling it, an Aswang might be a shapeshifter who turns into a dog or a pig at night. It might be the manananggal, a creature able to split its body at the waist, the upper half sprouting bat wings and flying off to hunt while the legs stay behind, standing upright in a field somewhere, waiting. It might hunt with an impossibly long, thin tongue, capable of sliding through tiny gaps, a crack in a window, a gap under a door, to feed on whoever's sleeping inside. Some versions specifically target pregnant women. It is, in short, exactly the kind of folklore that's terrifying precisely because it isn't tidy. You don't know what shape it's wearing. You don't know where the door needs to be locked. And Lansdale's Psywar team looked at all of that and saw, essentially, raw material. So here's what they actually did, according to Lansdale's own later account, written in his memoir years afterward. And I want to flag up front that this entire story rests almost entirely on Lansdale's own telling of it. There's no independent military record, no second witness giving a competing account, no Huck survivor on record confirming the details. Just one man writing about his own operation years later in a book. Keep that in your back pocket. We'll come back to it. According to Lansdale, His team identified a hook unit camped on a hill, somewhere between 100 and 300 fighters. They needed that unit gone, without a fight, so a Saiwar squad started quietly seeding rumors among nearby villagers, people who had regular contact with the hooks, who fed them, sheltered them, passed messages up the hill. The rumor was simple. There's an Aswang living up there now. Something's been killing people on that hill. They gave it 2 days to travel. Rumors, like anything else, need time to spread.
Then, on the third night, Lansdale's men set up an ambush on a trail they knew the hooks used for patrols. When a patrol came through in the dark, they silently grabbed the very last man in line, the easiest one to take without anyone noticing, and killed him. They punctured his neck twice, vampire style. They held the body up by the ankles to drain it of blood, and then they put him back, exactly where they'd taken him, for his own unit to find.
When the rest of the patrol doubled back and found him, bloodless, marked, laid out on the trail like an offering, Lansdale wrote that every one of them believed the Aswang had gotten their friend, and that any one of them could be next if they stayed on that hill. By daybreak, the entire unit had abandoned the position. No firefight, no casualties on the government side, 1 hook fighter dead, and an entire armed camp gone in a single night. Because of fear instead of force. Lansdale, by his own account, considered this one of his more elegant pieces of work.
Okay, here's where I want to slow down, because there's a version of this story, and you've probably seen it, it's all over the internet, that treats this as some kind of masterclass in psychological warfare. The CIA, 4 steps ahead of everyone, weaponizing an entire nation's folklore with surgical precision. The actual picture is messier and more interesting than that. For one thing, by most accounts, this exact tactic, the staged vampire killing, appears to have happened exactly once, not dozens of times, not as a standing program. 1 operation against 1 unit on 1 hill. It became famous mostly because Lansdale himself told the story vividly in his memoir, and because the CIA staged a vampire attack is, understandably, the kind of sentence that travels.
For another, at least one researcher who spent years specifically studying Philippine folklore, not Cold War history, the actual monster lore, has pointed out that the specific region where this happened may not have had especially strong Aswang as blood-sucking vampire traditions to begin with, which raises an uncomfortable possibility. Maybe what actually terrified that patrol wasn't ancient folkloric dread. Maybe it was just finding their friend's corpse, mutilated, drained, and silently placed back on a trail by someone who'd gotten that close to them without anyone noticing. You don't need to believe in vampires to be terrified by that. You just need to be human. And honestly, either explanation is disturbing in its own way. One version says, the US government studied a culture's deepest fears and used them as a weapon. The other version says, the US government murdered someone and staged the body to look like a monster did it, and that alone was enough. Pick your nightmare.
What's not really in dispute is the bigger picture. The Aswang Op was one tactic among several deployed alongside actual military pressure, defections, amnesty offers, and years of grinding counterinsurgency. The Hook Rebellion didn't collapse because of one vampire. It collapsed slowly, over years, worn down from a dozen directions at once. And the vampire story is the one detail vivid enough that everybody remembers it 60-plus years later instead of the spreadsheets. By May of 1954, the Hook leader, Luis Taruc, surrendered and accepted a prison sentence. The insurgency that had once seemed capable of threatening the entire Philippine state was effectively over.
But Lansdale wasn't finished, because somewhere in the middle of all this, he'd found something he considered even more valuable than a haunted hillside. He'd found his president. His name was Ramon Magsaysay, and on paper, He was exactly the kind of guy you'd want leading a fight against a peasant insurgency rooted in inequality and corruption. He wasn't from the old landed elite that dominated Philippine politics. He'd been a guerrilla leader against the Japanese himself, which gave him real credibility with rural Filipinos in a way most politicians of the era simply didn't have. As Secretary of National Defense, he had a reputation, genuinely earned by most accounts, for actually going out to the provinces, talking to poor farmers, treating the war against the Hooks as something that needed winning hearts as much as winning battles. Lansdale met him, and by every account on record, the two men hit it off almost immediately. Lansdale needed a Filipino partner who had legitimacy he could never have, being an American. Magsaysay needed resources, intelligence, and organizational muscle he didn't have on his own. It was, on the surface, a partnership. What it became was something considerably stranger. When Magsaysay resigned as defense secretary in early 1953, a calculated move, positioning himself to run for president, Lansdale didn't just offer advice from the sidelines. He effectively became the campaign.
Lansdale helped organize the entire Magsaysay for President movement from the ground up. And here's a detail that should genuinely stop you. The campaign's central slogan, the one that ended up on banners and buttons across the country, "Magsaysay is my guy." That wasn't a Filipino political strategist's idea. That was Lansdale's. An American intelligence officer wrote the tagline for a Philippine presidential campaign.
It gets stranger. There's a song, Mambo Magsaysay, a jaunty, jazzy, Cuban-style mambo number that played constantly across Manila in the spring of 1953, calling on Filipinos to vote against corruption and vote for the young defense secretary. For decades, the official story was that it came together organically. A Filipino songwriter, a Filipino singer, a grassroots campaign jingle, genuinely one of the first uses of a pop song as a presidential campaign ad anywhere in the world. Except investigative reporting that went digging through Lansdale's own declassified cables, held today at the Hoover Institution archives at Stanford, found something else. Cables in which Lansdale describes helping write the song himself and planning exactly how to get it into the country, not by smuggling thousands of records past customs, but by pressing the master copies in the United States and then bringing those in to be mass-produced locally. The CIA, in other words, may have manufactured a hit single. They reportedly hedged their bets and put together two competing campaign songs just in case the first one didn't catch on.
And it caught on. People danced to it in nightclubs who had absolutely no idea they were dancing to a piece of American intelligence work. Then there's the speeches. Magsaysay's actual speechwriter, through much of the campaign and into his presidency, was a man named David Sternberg, a wheelchair-bound CIA officer. The words coming out of the candidate's mouth, in front of crowds who believed they were hearing the authentic voice of a war hero turned reformer, were, with real regularity, written by an American intelligence operative.
And the money. Philippine law at the time explicitly barred foreign nationals from funding election campaigns. According to reporting on the period, U.S. business interests in the islands funneled roughly $250,000 into Magsaysay's campaign anyway, at a moment when his party was seriously short on cash. Lansdale also worked to mobilize civic groups, JCs, Rotarians, and coordinated with an election monitoring organization called NAMFREL, ostensibly to guarantee a clean and fair vote, which is a genuinely strange thing to read twice. The same operation simultaneously funding an illegal foreign cash injection into one candidate's campaign and organizing the watchdog group meant to keep the election honest. And in case none of that worked, in case the incumbent, Elpidio Quirino, somehow pulled off a win, fair or not, there was a contingency. Accounts from the period describe an actual plan for Magsaysay to declare a provisional government and have Quirino arrested if the election results looked fraudulent. A coup ready to go, sitting quietly in reserve.
They never needed it. On November 10th, 1953, Magsaysay won by a landslide. 2 days later, he and Lansdale were together on the yacht called the Marguerite, owned by the commander of U.S. naval forces in the Philippines, when word came through that Quirino had conceded.
On December 30th, 1953, Ramon Magsaysay was sworn in as the third president of the Third Philippine Republic. It's worth being careful here about where the evidence is rock solid and where it gets shakier. The slogan, the speechwriter, the illegal foreign funding, the coordination with NAMFREL, those are well documented, including in serious historical scholarship and declassified material. The Mambo song story is backed by actual cables in the Hoover archive, about as good as Cold War sourcing gets. Some of the wilder claims that circulate online, that Lansdale personally drugged rival candidates, that he physically assaulted Magsaysay to keep him in line, show up mostly on lower-tier blogs without solid citation, and I'm not going to present those to you as established fact. The documented version is disturbing enough on its own. You don't need to embellish it.
So, what do you actually get at the end of all this? You get, by most accounts, a genuinely popular president. Magsaysay's reform efforts, land redistribution attempts, anti-corruption pushes, his hands-on style of actually visiting the rural poor made him broadly beloved in the Philippines in a way that, frankly, a lot of CIA-installed leaders around the world never managed to pull off. He wasn't a hated dictator propped up by force. He was, by most measures, a likable, reasonably effective president who happened to owe his entire path to power to a foreign intelligence service, which is, in some ways, the most unsettling version of this story. It's easy to feel comfortable condemning a sham election that installs a brutal strongman. It's harder to sit with a sham election funded illegally, scripted in part by a foreign government, backed by a literal coup contingency that installs someone genuinely well-liked by the people he ends up governing. The process was the problem, even when, by some measures, the outcome wasn't a disaster for the people living through it. Sovereignty doesn't get less violated just because the puppet turns out to be popular. Lansdale, for his part, kept rising. He'd go on to be called one of the 10 greatest spies in CIA history by a later CIA director. And he took exactly this playbook, the cultural psyops, the candidate grooming, the speeches written behind the scenes, the staged events designed to manufacture belief, and carried it with him to his next assignment.
Vietnam. This is the part of the story that turns from strange Cold War trivia into something with real, lasting weight. Because Lansdale didn't treat the Philippines as a weird one-off. He treated it as proof of concept. In Vietnam, he tried to do almost exactly the same thing. Find a credible local leader, in this case, no-go DM, and build him into a stable, US-aligned head of state through advice, support, organization, and image management. Lansdale even ran Psy-war operations there with the same basic theory: exploit local belief systems, manufacture fear and rumor, manage perception as carefully as you manage troop movements.
It did not go the same way. DM was not Magsaysay. The political and religious dynamics of Vietnam were not the dynamics of the Philippines, and the strategy that had quietly, almost elegantly, installed a popular reformer in Manila helped instead lay groundwork for one of the longest and most catastrophic conflicts of the entire Cold War. Same architect, same toolkit, wildly different result, which tells you something important. This wasn't really a story about a uniquely brilliant man who'd cracked the code of human psychology. It was a story about an approach that happened to work once in a specific country with a specific candidate against a specific insurgency, and that the people running it then assumed would simply work everywhere else too. And here's the thing that should really sit with you after all of this. The Philippines in 1953 was not some isolated anomaly in American Cold War history. It was, more or less, a template. Just a few years earlier, in 1948, the CIA had run its first major foreign election operation, pouring something like $10 million into Italy to help the Christian Democrats beat back a strong communist-aligned opposition. The Philippines came right after. And after the Philippines came a long, long list. Covert funding for political parties in Japan, payments meant to weaken socialist movements there, financial support for opposition movements in Guatemala in the late 1950s, aimed at toppling a government Washington didn't like. Covert funding poured into Bolivian politics through the 1960s.
The specific tools varied. Sometimes it was cash, sometimes it was a coup, sometimes, and this is the detail that should really stick with you, it was a song on the radio that an entire country was dancing to, with absolutely no idea where it actually came from. The Aswang story gets remembered because it's vivid and grotesque and almost cinematic. A man hung upside down on a jungle trail, drained of blood by his own government's intelligence service to scare an army off a hill. It's the kind of detail that makes a great cold open for a video.
But the vampire wasn't really the point. The vampire was a tool, deployed once on one hill against a few hundred frightened men. The actual operation, the one that mattered, the one with consequences that rippled forward for decades, was quieter than that. It was a slogan. It was a jingle nobody knew was written in a CIA cable. It was a speech delivered by a man who didn't write a word of it. It was an election that looked from the outside like democracy working exactly as it should. The monster was never real. Everything that came after it, the song on the radio, the words from the podium, the president himself, smiling, popular, beloved, that part was, and somebody else had written almost all of it.